We're sitting around a campfire, and naturally the ghost stories begin. What's yours? Not safe for work, posted 2 days ago. One very dark morning in the deserts of New Mexico, I was arriving for an early shift at about 4 a.m. I worked a few miles from a site where they tested or experimented on monkeys, and some say secretly on prisoners during the Manhattan Project. Ghost stories in this area abound. However, I experienced it firsthand on this morning. As I was walking through the empty parking lot, I see something out of the corner of my eye, standing near the east side of the building. I look up, and there stood a man with glowing eyes. Knowing there are lots of glowing-eyed critters in the area, my brain immediately tried to explain this as an animal standing on its hind legs. Terrifying enough, but at least it's not a man, right? Wrong. This man-figure ghost creature waved at me, and then motioned for me to come that way. Obviously, the answer was fuck that, and I continued toward the entrance of the building, clutching the knife I had in my pocket. Suddenly, the figure begins to run at me. I freeze and stand ready to fight for my life, but just as the figure gets within about 20 feet of me, it vanishes. I was shaking from the adrenaline for about an hour, and this has stuck with me since that day. I still have a hard time walking anywhere in the dark. This happened to me while I was sitting on the side of a mountain in the middle of National Forest. I was on an overlook, so below me it was rather steep. I have no explanation for this, but a rock the size of a football or watermelon flew through the air, coming in my general direction. It came from below me. How could a rock that size fly upwards at me? True ghost story. I've started calling him Peter. When I was little, there was a nightlight on my wall. The light was just enough for me to see into the hallway, as the door was usually left open or cracked. I was always afraid of the hallway since my room had a direct view of the bathroom mirror. One night, as I lay in bed, I start looking at the nightlight. It casts a bit of light up the wall it's attached to, as it should. However, directly above the nightlight was a shadow. It appeared male but featureless. Even at a young age, you could tell that shadow couldn't be from the nightlight. After getting nervous and running across the house, one of my parents tucked me back into the bed. The shadow was gone. As I laid down fearful and peeked out from under the blanket, it was back. I slept with my parents that night and hadn't seen the shadow again. Posted before about the thing that followed my brother home. This might interest any jinn believers. So, little bro back in high school befriends this loner goth girl who invites him over. In her living room is a broken window taped over with sheet plastic. The plastic has long slashes cut into it, which my brother asks about. I conjured something, and now it's trying to get at me, she tells him. Little bro starts examining the cuts, theorizing about what kind of creature could have made them, how tall, how strong, etc. Knowing him, he probably said something smartass about it to try to hide his unease. He goes home, then goes to work. An hour or two later, our mom calls him and asks, why is every cup in the house full of ground glass? Every single cup in the house is turned up and filled with ground glass. He didn't have an answer. He asked our mom about it sometime later, and she either blocked it out or pretended not to remember. But I found one of those cups when visiting home and having a smoke in the attic undisturbed on a shelf where it had probably sat for years, full of multicolored, jagged shards of glass. There's a body farm somewhere close by, real close, and that's what they call it, the body farm. People die. Their lifeless bodies are interred into the grisly forest hideaway. Each is assigned an anonymous identification number. Some are situated to provide interesting decomposition vectors, while others are used to reconstruct specific circumstances for investigations. At any given time, several dozen bodies of perished persons are scattered around the hillside within automobiles, cement vaults, suitcases, plastic bags, shallow graves, pools of water, or deposited directly upon the earth. Except when clothing is necessary for a particular study, cadavers are disrobed, and frequently certain factors such as fire and chemicals are introduced to measure their effect. Then, grad students from the nearby university and professors return periodically to check on their subjects' progress, with occasional visits from police officers or FBI agents. Once I was home alone. There was a storm door from the bathroom were opening and closing, and my cat was just staring at the door, and I saw a random shadow sometimes I could hear footsteps and I live in like 50-year-old house. It was built when my country was still part of the USSR, and previous family moved out for some reason as quickly as possible. Timber Lake Road. Where I live, there's this cemetery where settlers were killed. A woman's children were murdered, so out of grief she hung herself. To this day, she can be seen wandering the road searching for her kids. Well, if you drive into the cemetery and say, "I have your baby," people use more vulgar words added. Your vehicle won't be able to leave until she comes running, screaming up to your vehicle. Up in Toyabe, north of Yosemite, I was backpacking once and found a staircase. I'd gotten a bit off track and was mildly lost, as I had had to go around a large snowdrift and was trying to find my way back to the main route. If you've ever been in the eastern Sierras after a big snowfall, you'll know that main route is a relative term. This was before these staircases started to be talked about online, but mine was a little different. It almost looked like a rock formation with trees outlining it, like a trick of the eyes. Sort of like when you've been out of there for a few days and you're absolutely sure you see a bear, and it turns out it's the way your eyes are perceiving a tree in the foreground shaping a stump in the background. But as I got closer, the shape became more defined instead of less. I finally reached it, and sure enough, it was definitely a built staircase, not a geologic formation. It was crudely made out of bits of stone and wood, but definitely not natural. It was spiral too, so the top seemed to just disappear, even though I'm sure it didn't. I didn't have any sense of foreboding or fear, like people talk about online, but I did have the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, sort of like hallowed ground or something. The most interesting thing is that I didn't take a picture of it. I'm a photographer, and I have my camera with me at all times. But as others have said, there's sort of a time slip thing that happens, and you don't realize why, but you never climb the staircase, and before you know it, you're back hiking somewhere else. After I summited, I tried to find my way back, convinced to take a photo, but of course, I never could find it. And not just the staircase. I have a picture in my mind of the entire scene and area surrounding the staircase, and I couldn't get back to anything even remotely like it. Not then, and not since. I'm a person who spent a lot of my youth ghost hunting. I tried so very hard to find evidence of ghosts, and all my visits to haunted places earned me almost nothing at all. Only twice have I experienced things I couldn't explain. This is one of them. My two friends and I took a road trip after high school ended, staying in a haunted bed and breakfast at the first stop. I believe it was our second night there that we went downstairs late in the evening once everyone else was in bed and started poking around and taking photos, looking for ghosts or anything spooky or anomalous. We were in the front room when suddenly we heard the doorknob turn. We all froze, thinking someone was coming in late and would catch us messing around. The doorknob rattled and turned but didn't open. Now our thoughts had turned from ghosts, thinking that some stranger had come to the door and tried to get inside. A little frightened, we were relieved that the door was locked. We went up to bed more afraid of real people than ghosts. The next morning, as the three of us left the B&B, we paused at the front door. After opening the heavy wooden door, we were confronted with the heavy glass door that usually screeched and slammed as it was open or closed. None of us had realized until that moment that we hadn't heard it at all the night before. Only then did we realize that no one could have turned and rattled the knob without opening the glass door, at least no one from the outside. Strangely, we never talked about it afterwards, maybe a little too scared that we might have experienced something real. My dad and I were driving back from one of my hockey practices as a kid late at night. It was a cold, lonely 45-mile drive from the rink to my house through the untouched northern Michigan wilderness. We round a corner and a dog runs out of the ditch, and my dad tries to swerve but is not quick enough and we hit it. The dog was obviously deceased. My dad, wanting to do the right thing, turns into the driveway 20 yards up ahead, assuming it's the owner's home. Log house, lights all on. We go up the driveway. As we reach the house, every light turns off simultaneously. My dad gets spooked. Driveway is long, so he doesn't want to back down the entire thing in the snowy dark and decide to turn it around. As we get it facing the exit, I see two figures running from the front door of the house towards our vehicle. My dad notices it as well before I even have time to scream. He slams on the gas and nearly topples us into the ditch as we skid out back onto the highway. Looking back, I distinctly remember seeing not 2 but 4 figures standing halfway up the driveway. The other thing I noticed that we didn't see when driving up to the house, a realtor sign. The house was up for sale and should have been empty. My grandfather once was walking through Baghdad in the 60s. As he was walking, he caught view of a Sufi order, and as they were dancing with prayer, a man gave another a dagger larger than any knife my father has ever seen and stabbed himself afterwards. He continued to dance and pray with the others. Not scary story, but still, Sufi order members usually don't stab themselves while praying. Also, huge dagger in chest, so yeah. Back in '76, I was camping with my friends and fiancé in a local forest. It was a dark summer night. I went to get more firewood when I heard a hard scream coming from our camp. I rushed towards it to see what was going on. I saw that our tents were torn, my friends nowhere to be seen, and the love of my life laying in a pool of blood. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, when suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my side. I turned around and saw him, a tall, dark figure in a work uniform. It was dark. I couldn't see his face, but I saw a horrid image I'll never forget. His empty eye socket stuffed with cotton. He tore the knife from my bleeding stomach and threw me on the ground. In the dying light of the campfire, I saw the name tag on his clothes saying Joe. Before he could finish me off, the sound of approaching sirens scared him off. He kicked me in the head and stormed off in an unknown direction. I barely made it. I needed a blood transfusion. Sadly, the other victims didn't. Sally bled out. They found Josh strung up on a tree with his guts hanging out. Mark is still missing. The worst part is, if it hadn't been for Cotton-Eyed Joe, I'd been married a long time ago. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Cotton-Eyed Joe. My dad used to be in Boy Scouts and went camping in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey once. His group came up to what appeared to be the foundations of an old house and decided there was a good place to camp. As they got into the night, things weren't feeling all that normal. Around 2 in the morning, they all of a sudden were swarmed with millions of bugs, and they were forced to leave. My dad says that foundation probably was the home of the New Jersey Devil, which had been locked up in the basement after being born with birth defects, and that the land still remained cursed. This is a true story my mom told me many times. 10 years before I was born, when my mom was 17, she and my grandma and mom were sitting on the couch one morning in the living room. From the living room, there was a small hall, and you could see the whole house. It's a pretty small house. My uncle and my grandpa were away visiting family in Mexico. My grandma, who was tired from just having my youngest aunt, stayed home with the rest of the family. So they're in the living room, talking. My grandma holds my aunt, and they see a little girl with long black hair. My mom feels something is off as this girl appeared from nowhere and ran into my grandparents' room. My mom and grandma ran to see as they both saw the girl. My grandma checked her room. Nothing's there. Only one way you can get in and out a door at the end of the hall. And my mom checked my outer aunt, who was 9 at the time, and she was fast asleep. For the next few seconds, they thought it was my aunt, since she of course had tan skin and black hair, plus she was the only girl in the house who wasn't an infant. Of course, it wasn't my aunt. She had short hair at the time, plus there was no way she could get from my grandparents' room to her room. They checked the house and found no girl, no matter where they looked. And strange thing is, my mom described how the girl seemed so unfazed by her surroundings, like she was running in fields, not a house. After no explanation to what could have happened, since they clearly saw the girl in their view for a good few seconds, they concluded it was a ghost. I was a skeptic at first, thinking it had to be something else, but I still have not been able to conclude in any explanation that isn't supernatural. Maybe they saw a ghost from a little girl whose family lived in the area before Europeans showed up. I've been trying to find any info to see if my grandparents' house is near an old village. It could be that my grandparents live near a cemetery that's pretty old and dates back to the late 19th century. I live in a forest, rural zone. Once with some friends, I was chilling after playing D&D. We were calm and we wanted something to eat. So we called a local pizzeria. Everything was quiet, but when the call ended, we heard a weird breath, heavy, loud, and tortured. We thought that was a prank from the pizzeria employee or an interference. So we continued to chill without thinking it was important. We heard a weird breath again. This time we started to panic because the phone was off and we were home alone. So one of them gone to check. He never came back. So I went to check. I saw his poor dead body with ripped legs, heavily bleeding, laying close to a creature made of rotting flesh with a mouth opened mid-head with no face. Last thing I knew, the police came by.